that is affecting each and every American. Opioid overdose is now the leading cause of death for Americans between the ages of 18 and 49. Those who have lost their lives to these overdoses are not just nameless statistics. There are families, our friends, our neighbors. And today, we'll hear more about the impact that deadly drugs like fentanyl and fentanyl analogs are having on our communities. In 2022 alone, the DEA seized over 379 million lethal doses of fentanyl in the United States. Unfortunately, that's enough to kill each and every American. The majority of fentanyl that is found in the United States is being produced by the drug cartels from the supplies that they receive from China. Once trafficked over our porous southern border, the volume of drugs that we are seeing has made each and every state a border state. This problem touches every district in our country, and it is critical that on Energy and Commerce Committee, we work to find a solution. For over a year, Republicans have been trying to permanently ban fentanyl-related substances by labeling them as Schedule I narcotics. This designation will help give law enforcement the tools that they need to stop the drug trafficking that's killing American citizens and doing it by the cartels without any sign of remorse. Each day, we're hearing from parents who deserve justice because they've lost a child, parents who don't want to see anyone else experience the same pain that they have felt. We should be working together to punish those who produce, import, and distribute these poisons to our children, and help those with substance use disorders find the necessary treatment and the necessary recovery. Today, two of those parents from Pennsylvania have joined us. I'm incredibly grateful to Ray and Deb Cullens from Shippensburg for joining us today to discuss their experiences and to share what happened to their son, Zach, who was tragically killed by a fentanyl and cocaine overdose. As we begin this discussion, I'll ask each panelist to introduce themselves and provide brief opening remarks. And then after that, we'll turn to question and answer from the committee members. I want to personally thank our participants for being here today and taking time out of your busy schedules to travel to Washington and to share your important insights. Your voices are critical in informing us as we make the necessary policy changes and helping us win the debate to permanently schedule these deadly substances. First, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Deb and Ray Cullens.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for allowing us to come and share our story. We are here today to discuss the fentanyl epidemic, which is targeting the young people of our country, and to discuss some things that we would like to see done so that other parents do not receive a visit from the police informing them that their child is dead. That is exactly what we experienced 19 weeks ago. The state police knocked on our door and informed my husband that our son Zachary was dead, presumably from an overdose. Our lives were forever changed at that moment. He was the youngest of our 3 boys, and he died just 9 days after his 23rd birthday. Zachary was a wonderful young man who was in college studying business. He had been working for Papa John's for 4 years, delivering pizzas. And he was also working on developing a technology company on the blockchain platform. That was his dream and his passion. His other love was basketball, especially those pickup games in the driveway with his dad and 2 older brothers. Just last season, his intramural team at college won the championship. He was so excited. But even more impressive was his kind and his compassionate heart. Zachary helped numerous people throughout his short 23 years. Just this summer at the beach, a friend was caught in a riptide and was on the verge of drowning. Zachary didn't think twice before swimming out and holding his friend above the waves until the lifeguards got out to save them. Last year around this time, one of his co-workers mentioned that they were behind on their rent and were afraid of being evicted. Zachary had just received money for Christmas from his grandfather, so he found out how much money was needed, anonymously placed cash in an envelope, and slipped it into his co-worker's car. That was our son. He loved his family. He loved his friends. He loved life. Zachary did not suffer from substance abuse disorder. He was not an addict. However, following his death, we did learn that he had used cocaine on occasion. We were told that cocaine is a commonly used recreational drug on campus and at Greek life parties. Zachary, however, did not die at school. He and a couple of friends Ubered to Harrisburg to celebrate a birthday. Sorry. We were told by the detective that they were not in a bad section of the city, nor were they seeking out drugs. They were downtown at a few restaurants and bars, eating, drinking, and having fun. The detective also told us that he believes the boys were targeted by a dealer. Why? We don't know. We don't know if it was because they were intoxicated, they had been drinking, and they also had some cash on them. We will never know why. But they made the decision to purchase some coke that night. That was a poor decision, but that decision should not have killed my son. Someone intentionally laced that cocaine with fentanyl. Our son did not die of an accidental overdose. He was poisoned. There's a difference. Actually, he was murdered. We beg of you to get the word out about illicit fentanyl to everyone. This is urgent and must be done immediately because we need to slow down the rate at which families are losing their loved ones. This crisis should be attacked the same way COVID was. You could not turn on the television without hearing about COVID, about its statistics and what our government was doing to protect it, to protect us and to fight. It should be the same with illicit fentanyl. People need to know the statistics that more than 110,000 people died from overdoses last year. A majority of those involved illicit fentanyl. It takes only 2 milligrams of fentanyl to kill. That's about the size of 10 to 15 grains of salt. One packet of Sweet and Low, if filled with fentanyl, is enough to kill 500 people. Let me repeat that. A Sweet and Low packet, if filled with fentanyl, could kill 500 people. Parents need to know that these drugs are not just the ones being bought on the street or through dealers or from their child's friend, but nowadays they are also being bought through social media platforms such as Snapchat. And most of the kids purchasing on social media, they're not addicts. They are stressed out, depressed, and anxious kids looking for something to help them calm down, something to help them sleep, or something to help them focus so that they can study. They have no idea that 60% of all the drugs bought either from a dealer or on social media, that 60% are laced with enough fentanyl to kill them. It is a real-life game of Russian roulette, and most of them don't even know they're playing it. And if the pill that they take or the coke that they snort does not kill them, they have a high probability of becoming an addict. And they will most likely continue to search out that high until it kills them too. Unfortunately, people suffering from substance abuse disorder or addiction seem to be looked at as less in our country, but they're not. They are someone's child, someone's parent, someone's sibling, and their lives matter just as much as our sons. I struggle to understand why our government is not making it a priority to stop the loss of so many lives. My husband heard of this comparison the other day and thought it was very impactful. Another way to look at this is to compare it to 9/11. On that terrible day, nearly 3,000 people lost their lives to a terrorist attack. And our government responded quickly, intentionally, and with force. Do you know that we are currently losing 3,000 people every 2 weeks from illicit fentanyl? I know that our government is fully aware of where the chemicals are originating, who is manufacturing it, and how it is being brought into our country. On December 20th, as Dr. Joyce had stated, the DEA announced that in 2022, there were over 379 million potentially deadly doses of illicit fentanyl seized. That's just what was seized. This is enough fentanyl to kill every single American. The United States and our youth are under attack. Our son did not die in vain, and we will do everything in our power to make sure of that. Our government should be taking the lead to fight this horrible crisis and doing everything in its power to stop it. First and foremost, all Americans need to be informed. Second, there needs to be tougher laws around illicit fentanyl, like making mandatory minimum sentences for dealers who are caught selling drugs that kill somebody. And last, but definitely not least, our government needs to stop the flow of fentanyl that is coming into our country and hold those countries and those people responsible. As I said before, this is urgent. Right now, grieving parents seem to be leading the way. We need you to take over so that we can stop fighting and take the time that we need to grieve our unimaginable loss. And for us, that loss was our son, Zachary. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mrs. Ray. Next, I'd like to turn the conversation over to Paul Nerum, who is the former Assistant Administrator and Chief of Intelligence for the U.S. DEA. Administrator Nerum has spent over 30 years working on these issues in both the United States and South America, and his experience will be invaluable to our discussion today. Mr. Nerum.
Good morning. Thank you. I would like to thank the committee for the invitation and opportunity to be here to participate in this important discussion this morning. I want to personally thank Mr. and Mrs. Cullens.
Can I ask you to move the microphone a little closer?
I don't know if it's on. The light's not coming on. I'll speak louder.
There you go.
Is it on now? Thank you. I want to personally thank Mr. and Mrs. Cullens. What you have been through is unimaginable, yet you are here with incredible strength and courage to ensure that your voice and important message is heard. You are an inspiration to all of us. My deepest condolences for your loss, and thank you for what you are doing. I would also like to take a moment to recognize that this past Monday, January 9th, was Law Enforcement Appreciation Day. I would personally like to thank DEA and all law enforcement personnel for their service, hard work, sacrifices, and dedication to duty demonstrated each and every day to keep our community safe. Law enforcement is a noble profession, and I am grateful for having had the honor and privilege to serve alongside some of the finest individuals I have known. I joined the DEA in 1991 as a special agent and was proud to enforce the Controlled Substances Act on behalf of the American people for over 30 years. My perspective is informed by my years of experience as a special agent in the trenches, as a group supervisor, as an assistant regional director, assistant special agent in charge, as the deputy chief of operations, and as the assistant administrator and chief of intelligence for DEA. It It was a privilege and honor to serve every day, and I am grateful for having had the opportunity to do so. As a career DEA special agent, I devoted my professional life to enforcing the law and keeping our communities safe and free from harmful illicit substances. DEA works to bring to criminal and civil justice system of the United States or any other competent jurisdiction those organizations and principal members of organizations involved in growing, manufacturing, or distribution of controlled substances appearing in or destined for illicit traffic in the United States. In 2018, I had the honor of representing DEA testifying in Congress on multiple occasions. In preparation for today's discussion, I reviewed my statements submitted to the various committees. It is striking to me that the opioid epidemic continues to be a significant threat to public health and safety, and the threat has increased since those hearings in 2018. It remains a national security threat. I know it is a priority for DEA and DEA's federal, state, local, and international partners. I know that every DEA special agent, intelligence research specialist, chemist, diversion investigator, and every member of the DEA family are committed to this effort. They feel an extraordinary sense of urgency and are relentlessly and aggressively pursuing those responsible for the proliferation of fentanyl and other controlled substances such as methamphetamine, heroin, and cocaine. I am confident that DEA is taking a data-driven approach, turning intelligence into action that will have a greater community impact with regards to the opioid crisis and the violence associated with drug trafficking. I believe and share in the conviction that law enforcement must remain steadfast in their pursuits of keeping harmful and oftentimes deadly substances out of the United States, holding accountable those who violate the laws of the United States. Last year, over 107,000 Americans died from drug poisonings. Drug poisoning is the leading cause of death of Americans aged 18 to 45. Fentanyl is highly addictive, 50 times more potent than heroin. As Mrs. Cullen mentioned, just 2 milligrams of fentanyl can kill a person, about the amount that can fit on the tip of a pencil. Many of the people who died from fentanyl have no idea that they took the drug. This is why these drugs are referred to as poisonings and not overdoses. Organized criminal networks are using deception to hide fentanyl in fake counterfeit pills that are designed to look like prescription drugs such as OxyContin, Percocet, Adderall, Xanax, and others. As I previously mentioned, illicit drugs, as well as the transnational and domestic criminal organizations that traffic them, continue to represent significant threats to public health, public safety, and national security. Make no mistake, the Mexican drug cartels, specifically the Sinaloa cartel and the CJNG, are the transnational criminal organizations that comprise the greatest criminal drug threat to the United States. These two cartels in Mexico are violent criminal organizations responsible for mass producing and supplying virtually all of the deadly fentanyl in the United States. The precursor chemicals principally originate in China. The Sinaloa cartel and the CJNG are polydrug organizations that maintain the most expansive footprint in the United States. The illicit drugs are transported through U.S. ports of entry and across the border using myriad methods and conveyances. These Mexican polydrug trafficking organizations traffic illicit drugs, and now more than ever, fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances, which are responsible for so many deaths over the last several years, using established transportation routes and distribution networks. They control drug trafficking across the southwest border and continue to expand their share of the U.S. illicit drug market. Their influence up and down the supply chain, their ability to enter new markets, and their association with domestic distribution networks remain a significant threat. I'm confident the DEA continues to address this threat by targeting the most significant drug traffickers and their entire networks aggressively and relentlessly, attacking the crime and violence perpetrated by these Mexico-based transnational criminal organizations. DEA is laser-focused on defeating these two cartels. Traffickers, wittingly or unwittingly, are increasingly selling fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances to users without mixing it with any other controlled substances, and are also increasingly selling fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances in the form of counterfeit prescription pills. Fentanyl suppliers continue to experiment with new fentanyl-related substances and adjust supplies in an attempt to circumvent new regulations. The need for permanently scheduling of fentanyl as a class remains. I'd like to highlight a couple of things that can be found on DEA.gov. DEA launched the One Pill Can Kill campaign to inform the American public of the dangers of fake prescription pills that the only safe prescription medications are ones prescribed by trusted medical professionals that you get from licensed pharmacists. All other pills are unsafe and potentially deadly. The DEA laboratory has found that of the fentanyl-laced fake prescription pills analyzed in 2022, 6 out of 10 now contain a potentially lethal dose of fentanyl. This is an increase from DEA's previous announcement in 2021 that of those pills analyzed, 4 out of 10 fentanyl-laced fake pills contain potentially lethal dose. Criminal drug networks are mass-producing fake pills and falsely marketing them as legitimate prescription pills to deceive the American public. Fake pills are easy to purchase, widely available, often contain fentanyl or methamphetamine, and can be deadly. I want to emphasize the increasing probability of counterfeit pills containing a potentially lethal dose of fentanyl. Fake prescription pills are easily accessible and often sold on social media and e-commerce platforms, making them available to anyone with a smartphone, including minors, using emojis. Many fake pills are made to look like prescription opioids, as previously mentioned. This fight against the drugs of abuse, with particular emphasis on fentanyl, will not be remediated overnight. We all play a critical role and must all be persistent and consistent in supporting a holistic approach, that is, through law enforcement, prevention, education, and treatment. I thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Neer. And finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Timothy Westlake. Dr. Westlake is an emergency room physician and is a former chairman of the Wisconsin Examining Board, a former member of the Badger State-Controlled Substance Board. His work leading efforts on class-wide scheduling of fentanyl-related substances has been critical in the state of Wisconsin, and we're grateful that you're with us here today, Dr. Westlake.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Joyce, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to join today's roundtable and for your leadership. As Dr. Joyce said, I'm Tim Westlake, an emergency physician from Wisconsin, past chair of the Medical Examining Board, former member of Controlled Substances Board, and as well as being the primary architect of Wisconsin's prescription opioid reform strategy. In addition, I'm a licensed prescriber of buprenorphine or Suboxone, an opioid used for medication-assisted treatment, and I provide medical control for a statewide peer-to-peer recovery network that provides free Narcan education and access. Let me start by clarifying what fentanyl-related substances are and why scheduling them as a class is a critical policy tool. Fentanyl is a legal Schedule II highly potent opioid widely used for severe pain. Fentanyl-related substances, or FRSs, are highly active opioids, almost identical to fentanyl, except for a tiny difference in their chemical structure created by tweaking the chemical scaffold of fentanyl during synthesis in Chinese and cartel labs. The result of this chemical tweak is a new potent opioid with the same deadly effect as fentanyl, and which before FRS class scheduling was put in place, would have been legal until causing numerous deaths, raising them to be on the radar to be scheduled reactively by DEA. As you might imagine, telling parents, sometimes even friends, that their kids will never come home is oftentimes the worst part of my job. It was shortly after one such conversation with my good friend, Lori Badura, that the idea of fentanyl class scheduling reform came to mind. Lori's son Archie was an altar server with my daughters. First, it was prescription opioids, then IV heroin, and unknowingly fentanyl. I resuscitated Archie on his second-to-last overdose. At that time, I pulled out a body bag and laid it down next to him and warned him that that's where he would end up if he didn't get help. He stayed clean for 6 months until illicit fentanyl ended his life. One of the last things my friend Lori saw of her son Archie was him being zipped up into a body bag. Motivated to act by hundreds of deaths, FRS scheduling legislation, which is proactive and not reactive as had previously been the case, came together quickly and was enacted with a unanimous vote in the Wisconsin State Legislature in 2017. DEA quickly adopted it temporarily in 2018 as national policy. Before that, scheduling new fentanyls was like a lethal game of whack-a-mole. We literally had to wait for people to die before action could be taken. So why isn't the Wisconsin law permanent federal law? Some who oppose FRS scheduling point to the recent spike in deaths from illicit fentanyl as proof that it doesn't work. In reality, this is a confabulation and they're misconstruing the facts. FRS scheduling does not address illicit fentanyl. It was never designed to do so. Rather, it removes the incentive for transnational criminal organizations to create new fentanyl-related substances, thus stopping them from ever existing in the first place. It's truly the ultimate form of overdose prevention and harm reduction. At its core, it is not a law enforcement tool. designed to put criminals in jail. In fact, in the 5 years since FRS class scheduling has been in place, there have been a total of 8 federal prosecutions under the FRS scheduling language, half of whom had already known ties to drug cartels. Regarding sentencing guideline concerns, they are triggered by 10 and 100 grams, which at first glance seems harsh, but it's critical to remember that these quantities are enough to kill 5,000 and 50,000 people respectively. As well, there has never been a prosecution for a non-bioactive fentanyl-related substance. Why is this? It's because there are no non-bioactive fentanyl-related substances. All of them that have been countered and researched to date have been found to have potent opioid activity. Concerns raised about the potential negative impacts of FRS scheduling on research are mainly focused on Schedule I research writ large, not specifically addressed to fentanyl class research itself, and have already been addressed by discussions with stakeholders. These proposed research accommodations have been signed off on and are supported by the agencies and organizations representing academic scientific research in the U.S., including the National Institute of Drug Abuse, the National Institutes of Health, Department of Health and Human Services, and the FDA. These agreed-upon accommodations would significantly loosen research restrictions into studying all Schedule I substances, not just FRSs, and open up wide areas of research. For further clarification, there are an exceedingly small number of researchers who are registered to study fentanyls, approximately 30 in total. Many of these are DEA and Department of Defense subcontractors who are focused on the analysis, detection, and attempt to understand the harm of these substances. Any dampening or restricting of research is purely theoretical. Fentanyl and its derivatives have been extensively researched since its discovery in 1960, and not one fentanyl-based reversal or medication-assisted treatment agent has ever been found in the 60 years since. Naloxone or Narcan works exceedingly well at reversing overdoses. I use this on almost tragically a daily basis in my job in the emergency department. And Narcan works at reversing overdoses, including fentanyl, fentanyl-related substances. When it wears off, it can easily be administered. People die because they ingest a lethal dose of toxic opioids, not because Narcan isn't effective. In conclusion, for 5 years now, FRS class scheduling has been federal policy. I could not be more pleased about this and the big impact my small idea has had. In a matter of a few short years, the creation and distribution of new FRSs from China has ground to a halt. According to NIFLS, the National Forensic Laboratory Information System, FRS-related overdose and poisoning deaths have essentially ceased. In the devastating battle we are in against the scourge of fentanyl, the elimination of related substances that has previously escaped our scheduling and made their way to devastate communities across the nation is surely a bright spot. Unlike marijuana, hallucinogenics, cocaine, or even heroin, fentanyls are so toxic that they can be classified and actually have been used as chemical weapons. The lethal dose is 2 milligrams, as mentioned before, equivalent to 5 grains of sand, meaning that the amount, if this were fentanyl, this would be enough to kill 2,000 people in this packet of sugar. But FRS class scheduling reform is only temporary until Congress acts to enact it permanently. We must all work together to deploy every successful overdose prevention and harm reduction tool in our arsenal. The fact is, you can't die from ingesting something never created, nor can you be incarcerated for trafficking something that doesn't exist. That's the simplicity and beauty of FRS scheduling. Thank you again for the time to testify, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Westlake. Your insight, your boots-on-the-ground approach, I think, brings a lot to this discussion. As I open the floor to questions from other members, I would like to personally thank both Ray and Deb Cullen for coming from Shippensburg, Pennsylvania, to the United States Capitol to bring your message to us today. And so in that light, I would like to turn the questioning over to you first. Is there additional advice or general messaging that you would like to provide to the members of Energy and Commerce?
I think what I'd like to say is that we just want to make, what we've made our mission is to make awareness a critical piece of this. Whether it's through PSAs that could be done, where we can meet the youth at the level where they are on social media. So traditionally, we get our news from the mainstream, quote, the mainstream media. We watch ABC, NBC. That's not where the 18 to 25-year-olds are getting their news. So if there's a way or a means to get that message out about this danger, that would be something that we'd be, pardon me, very interested in doing, whether it's a PSA and also to get it out to the national media so that parents can have those conversations with their kids. Because as I've talked to a number of my clients, friends, there's a lot of hurt out there right now. There's a lot of anxiety, depression, and kids are turning to these things for help. And as I've told parents about it, the parents were not aware of what was going on, and many of them said that as soon as they hung up with me, they were having those conversations with those kids. So as many as those conversations can be had, maybe a life or two will be saved, and that's really what our goal is just to raise the awareness. As we said, we just want to slow the pace at which people are joining our ranks.
Thank you, Mr. Cullen. Mr. Neerum, you outlined for us programs at the DEA, programs that are designed to stop the flow of substances. Can you please describe for us, and we had conversations prior to this roundtable discussion, and I talked to you how these drugs end up in South Central Pennsylvania, in the counties, the beautiful counties that I represent. Can you talk to the whole table about how these cartels, how their influences continue, and how their influences have continued to expand?
Yes, thank you, Congressman, for the question. The majority of illicit drugs in the United States are either manufactured, produced, and/or transported through Mexico. The Mexican cartels are no longer drug-specific and have morphed into polydrug manufacturers and distributors. The problem is very complex, but DEA is taking an aggressive approach in fighting the global criminal networks of these two Mexican cartels that I mentioned before, the Sinaloa and the CJ&G. DEA is not waiting for the narcotics to get to the border. They're addressing this and going after the drugs where they're produced, where the precursor chemicals are coming from, and where they're transported. The two cartels that we're talking about use every means available to them to transport drugs, every conveyance that you can think of. It comes across the border through the ports of entry. It comes in through maritime ports. It comes in through vessels along the California coast. And so there are no conveyances or methods or means that they're not utilizing to transport this, and that includes the mail. So as I mentioned, DEA is laser focused on keeping these drugs and stopping them from coming into the United States. And the tools that can be provided, we've talked about a couple of them, permanent scheduling already this morning, just adds additional emphasis and ability for them to investigate and prosecute these traffickers.
Thank you, Mr. Neerum. Thank you to all of the witnesses for being here. Now I would like to yield time to Congressman Mike Burgess from Texas for his line of questioning.
Thank you, Dr. Joyce. You'd think the premier technology committee in Congress would have microphones that work, or at least the light that works. Thank you for sharing your powerful testimony with us today. This committee actually has a history of working on this problem, and in October of 2018, the President signed into law the Support Act, which was a product of this committee, and we'd literally worked it for a full year from the ground up, full member day, hearing input from all members all across the country, coming through the Health Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce, and it culminated with a bill signing in October of 2018. Unfortunately, what you always hear is you're fighting last year's war. And at that point, the problem with opiate abuse was it was coming from docs, right? Your dentist prescribed 60 pills after a root canal or a wisdom tooth extraction. The patient took 3, and the rest were then subject to diversion. So we worked hard on fixing that problem. We may have over-torqued the boat a little bit, doctor, and I apologize about that as well, because I've heard from a number of physicians that now we've made it difficult to prescribe in legitimate circumstances, but nevertheless, that was the focus, and the committee worked very well. The problem is, in the next 4 years, we haven't done, I want to be careful what I say here, the ensuing 4 years, there was no look back at what we passed in 2018, how is it working, how is the world changing? And several people on the committee have heard me talk about this. We're dealing with a different disease now than we were in 2018. 2018, it was diversion of legitimate prescriptions. Now it's fentanyl poisoning or fentanyl murder, as you so appropriately describe it. The scheduling is important. We've actually talked about that in a number of different ways. There, as you know, there are opponents to changing or permanently scheduling fentanyl. That's basically on the the worry about over-application of law enforcement. It seems like there should be a way that we can get to yes on that particular problem. So Dr. Westlake and Mr. Neerman, I appreciate your powerful testimony on how this can be one of the most, can provide some of the most significant preventive medicine by providing that permanent scheduling. Mr. Neerman, I know you probably did testify to this committee when we were sitting back on the dais working through the details that gave us the SUPPORT Act. There were some places where, even at the time, I knew we were coming up short. We attempted to outlaw the pill presses that are used, but for whatever reason, we're told from a constitutional basis, we couldn't do that. I don't know, freedom of the press I get, but freedom of the pill press I don't get. So there's still work there to be done. But do you have any, you've been through this with us, you've been along this with us for this journey. Are there any insights that you can give us based on your days at the DEA where we can best focus our efforts today?
Thank you for the question, and I do appreciate the efforts that the committee has taken in the past. I do feel like there are opportunities continue to present themselves on how we can address this, and to the point of the Cullens, I think awareness and education is one of the most significant. To your point about the pill presses, and with regard to permanent scheduling, they're using the pills and making these, mimicking counterfeit prescription drugs, right? And so anything that is an additional support to law enforcement with regard to being able to investigate and prosecute for the illicit manufacture of fentanyl will be helpful. I think that, there have been steps, and as the doctor mentioned, when the permanent scheduling, and I'm grateful that with the new appropriations that was just signed, there was an extension to the temporary scheduling, because that is, as the doctor mentioned, very reactionary. So making those things more permanent, because that becomes a very onerous on the investigator and the prosecutor to determine the molecular structure, as the doctor mentioned. So again, facilitating and working towards a permanent scheduling. Quite frankly, that's something that China was able to do based on our engagements, the U.S. engagement with China. And that's something that we still haven't completed. And so I would appreciate, and now in my situation, to be able to participate and help in this regard. I think the permanent scheduling would be something that would be very significant. And if there were additional controls on pill presses and dyes would be helpful.
Thank you all for your testimony today. Clearly, it's a problem that's going to require a lot of continuing work, because the world changes underneath us while we focus on a problem. So thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'll yield to Congressman Latta from Ohio for his line of questioning.
Well, thank you very much. And again, thanks to our witnesses for being here. And I just want to follow up with my good friend from Texas. I can't believe it's been already the 115th Congress. We passed H.R. 6. We took over 60 pieces of legislation. It was bipartisan to try to get to this opioid crisis that we had at that time. And as the doctor said, that we've watched things change. But the one thing that has not changed, unfortunately, are having our family members here and hearing your testimony. And I've had events in my district where we're having on the opioid crisis with the prescription drug side of this. But now, we're dealing with this. But the one thing is not changing is hearing from you. And we want to make sure that this gets stopped. And again, we put forth a good piece of legislation, but we have to keep continuing, because again, the other side keeps changing what they're doing out there. And when we've seen, as you brought forward the information about the 108,000 people that passed away in the last year from drug overdoses, but the vast majority of those being fentanyl related, when we've seen those numbers have dropped back, but we've seen them just skyrocket since the 115th Congress now. And it's not getting any better. And so we want to make sure that, as my good friend from Virginia and I have been working on legislation to have this as a Scheduled I drug, and making sure that, the researchers can continue their study. But it's important that we get it done, because again, these are the hearings that we don't want to have anymore. We don't want to hear this. But it's important that, again, for you to come forward, because again, too often, this is what I said, when I was in the Ohio legislature, I chaired judiciary committees. And I said, these are not just names or statistics out there. These are real people with family members that are going to, for the rest of their lives, think about this and have it on their heart. So I think it's important that, we move forward. And again, unfortunately, this morning on the news, I was listening to one of the programs, and they were talking about the fentanyl being seized at the border. And unfortunately, when I've been at the border on a couple of occasions, our Border Patrol agents are no longer doing what they're supposed to be doing. They become what they've called this morning social workers in too many cases. So we got to get them back out doing this, because when you think about the 14,000 pounds of fentanyl that came to this country, that there was interdicted, that's 7.5 times as much fentanyl that could kill every American, 7.5 times over. So we've got our work to do. But if I could I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Canarium?
Canarium, yes.
You brought something up, because this is our jurisdiction is very wide here. Not only do we have health, but we also have on the telecommunications side, which when you think about the internet and everything else. But you said something. When you talk about the fake prescription drugs being sold over the online. Could I get your perspective of how we could, start right there as to what we need to be doing to try to make sure that we can get this off and go to these the internets and say, look, we've got to clean this stuff up, and you can't have this stuff online. So how can we, as this committee, move forward on that?
Yeah, that's a very great question, Congressman. Thank you so much for asking. Because it's social media, the cartels and the distribution networks are using social media platforms to relentlessly expand their business and deceptively sell these fake pills to young people and teenagers alike. Social media companies are not doing enough to self-regulate. They know that their platforms are being used to sell illegal drugs. DEA, survivors, Congress, and the media have told social media companies this, right? So the online sale of drugs violates the terms of the services of the social media companies. The companies should be doing more to prevent their platforms from being used to sell illegal drugs. And there needs to be greater transparency and accountability to force social media companies to change. More resources, including technology and human review, for example, need to be devoted to stop the sale of drugs on social media platforms. And I think additionally, law enforcement needs the ability to conduct properly authorized judicial investigations. And so having these companies be compliant with judicial orders, allowing law enforcement to investigate would be very helpful as well.
Thank you. And if I could just ask a real quick question before my time runs out to Dr. Westlake. You're talking about on the what we need to be doing out there on scheduling. What's your opinion? What we need to get done, and because it's got to get done sooner than later.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working on this for 6 years, and it's kind of mind-boggling to me that an idea like this, which really is, it completely shuts off the spigot of fentanyl-related substances. So it stops them from being created in the first place. And so, I mean, there's all this illicit fentanyl and there's all this other stuff out there. I look at it like a fire hydrant with multiple spigots on it. We've shut down the fentanyl-related substance spigot of new substances. And so why open it back up? And that's what would happen if it doesn't become permanent. So it's to me, and my wife has told me she doesn't know why I have to keep coming out here. I've been out here for several hearings. And it's a no-brainer. It just needs to happen. And there's research accommodations that you guys have come up with, which I think are great as well. And I think it just needs to happen.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And again, thanks to our witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you. Next, I'll yield to Congressman Guthrie from the Commonwealth of Kentucky.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the Cullens for being here. I've been in the General Assembly in the Commonwealth and in here, and I've is that not working? I haven't seen, these lights aren't bright, so you can't tell if they're on or not. I've never seen legislation move quicker than when families get involved and tell their stories. So it's important you do that, and that's how your son lives on, and that's how you continue to make a difference. And thanks for willingness to do that. I kind of want to focus my questions more on technical moving forward. And I had Dr. Gupta, the head of drugs control policy, in Bowling Green. Actually, Senator McConnell had him there, and he met with our law enforcement officers. And I think he was really taken aback at how frustrated our law enforcement officers were. I mean, good friend of mine, Tommy Loving. I call his name out because he's a good friend of mine. I had to calm him down a little bit. He started out with, what in the world are you guys thinking up there? And it starts with, we had a hearing here last year, a year before, and I can't think of the actual title, but I think it was a deputy, I think an officer of drug control policy. But the question was, why don't we do fentanyl as a class? Why do them individually as they appear upon the system, which you've talked about? And his answer was, and it's in transcript, because this is incredulous that somebody from the Biden administration said this. He goes, well, what if somebody creates a fentanyl analog that's as safe as water? Do we want people to go to jail for selling that? That actually was said in this hearing. And who's going to, and I don't know why they step away from this, want to be away from this and not move forward. And the other thing is, because it just seems self-evident. Your wife says, why do you have to keep going talking about this when it's self-evident? It seems self-evident, but I was listening to an interview by Senator Booker from New Jersey who opposes this, and his argument was, well, because we have it temporarily scheduled, if scheduling the whole class of illicit fentanyl worked, why we're having such a problem now? And I know the answers to those, but for Mr. Neeren and Dr. Westlake, I just want to kind of set up those two questions. One, why do we need to schedule it as a class? And why is it fallacy to do the other? I think you've sort of answered a little bit. But why is Senator Booker's statement wrong that obviously even temporary scheduling doesn't work, so why would permanent? I think it's the volume coming across the border is the problem. But I'm not going to put words in your mouth and let you.
Exactly. So it's really a confabulation. So illicit fentanyl deaths have risen, but fentanyl-related substance deaths have ground to a halt, according to NIFLS. There's a GAO report that came out in 2021 that discussed this. And so when you look at what the intention of the bill was, so the fentanyl-related substance scheduling bill was very narrowly crafted. So there exists a body of research that tells chemical synthesis, that explains chemical synthesis for the structure-activity relationships. So all they have to do is look and see what different chemical they can add in the manufacture, and it's and it's all clearly documented and delineated in the research. The other piece is that, the idea that there's a non-bioactive fentanyl-related substance is purely theoretical. All their counter-arguments are purely theoretical, all the opposition arguments. There have been 36 fentanyl-related substances found. DEA has looked at 27 of them, and all of them are bioactive. Some of them there's one of them that's 7,000 times more potent than morphine.
Okay, get us Mr. Neering this. So I think we've got the Biden administration a little bit our direction where they say, okay, we want to permanently schedule illicit fentanyl analogs, but not make them subject to the mandatory minimums. So how does that change the dynamic if they're not subject to the mandatory minimums?
So, as you know, DEA is not involved in the legislation of sentencing guidelines, but what I would highlight is that the temporary scheduling is just that. And so when a new substance comes out, the burden and the onerous burden of proof on the government and on the prosecutor to prove, and I might be using the wrong term, I refer to it as the molecular structure of the compound of the fentanyl-related substance is on the government. Scheduling them as a class is not a temporary solution. It is something that would give the investigators and the prosecutors that additional support in order to continue on with their prosecutions. This is a priority for DEA for the permanent scheduling. And I also think that it's important to understand that the process that, as the doctor mentioned in his opening remarks, is reactionary. This will be a proactive step that would really have the ability to, because what happens is the traffickers respond to what's scheduled and what isn't, and they change the molecular structure. So we're giving, without permanent scheduling, we are giving them a ready-made reason and way to circumvent the law.
I just have 2 or 3 minutes. When I talk about this at a Rotary Club or anything back home, people have the same reaction your wife has. Why in the world is this not permanently scheduled? It's just incredulous that the Biden administration and the other side of the aisle has held this up. So I appreciate it, and I'll yield back.
Can I add one thing to that?
He'll let you add, I'll let you.
So the piece about, a non-bioactive substance, someone trafficking that's kind of absurd for many different reasons. All the fentanyl-related substances to date have been bioactive. The cartels are not in the business of selling dud drugs. That's a bad business model for the cartels. And the legislation that is out there with the research accommodations has rapid descheduling in it. So if it's found, if it's found that it is not that it is inert and not biologically active, then there's the ability, with that, if that legislation were to pass, to completely stop that and reverse that and you know,
So if they're selling water as packaged as fentanyl, we could deschedule that.
it would be, yeah, automatically.
What cartel would ever do that?
Right.
That was what was silly. It was
Yeah.
just absolutely embarrassing that the minister did that. But anyway, that's just my.
Thank you. Next, I'll yield to Congressman Griffith from the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. We've had the Commonwealths represented today, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and now Virginia. It wasn't the order I was originally going to take it in, but let me jump into the HALT Act, which Representative Latta and I have been pushing now for a couple of years, and we've had a number of votes on it, and the mandatory minimum has been at least the reason that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle have said they've not want to do it. And let me just tell y'all, and I think you tell me if you agree, Dr. Westlake, or not, if we have to have an argument as a public policy argument on whether or not we should or should not have mandatory minimums, they exist in a lot of different categories, that's a valid issue for debate on another day. But right now, we have young men and women across the country, like your son, who are passing away, and I don't know whether that was an analog or not, but we need to make all of these Schedule 1, and I think the bill is important to get passed, and we've had several slight additions or variations in it. We're dealing with a court case out of McRae, out of the Western District of New York. We want to make sure everybody would like their language. They said, yeah, that's what Congress intended in an act from 1986, but that's just a district court. That's not a circuit court. That's not the Supreme Court. And so we're trying to incorporate language that doesn't undo or make it look like we're trying to reverse what they said in that case. But I'm very hopeful that sometime within the next few days, we'll get the newest version of the HALT Act out, which would make it permanently scheduled. And I think that's extremely important. And so would you agree that we should have that other debate on another day and get this done now?
Yeah, absolutely. That was my, from the beginning, there was opposition to that. Initially, they said, oh, it's going to incarcerate all these people and it's going to differentially impact people of color. And then when it found out that there were 8, prosecutions in 3 years, that had to go away. So then they jumped onto the research piece and they said, oh, it's going to negatively impact research, even though there's never been any substances in the fentanyl class that have had that. So it's absolutely, it's critical. I think the politics is being pulled into it, and the mandatory minimum piece as well. The piece about mandatory minimums, so if you take the mandatory minimums away, then you're going to shift them to, instead of producing illicit fentanyl, they just modify it one tiny step in the chemical synthesis, and now it's going to be illicit fentanyl-related substances that are going to.
And that, in fact, was the defense argument in that McRae case, that because they were dealing with one of the analogs, it wasn't covered. In fact, in that case, DEA had listed it. Begins with a B. I apologize, I forgot the name of it, but it was an analog that began with a B, and because it had been listed as being a controlled substance, they argued that the mandatory minimums didn't apply because it was no longer under the catch-all that was in there for our temporary laws. The court ruled against the defendant, which in this case we would all agree with, and but we want to make sure we don't take that opinion and give the wrong impression, so we're changing the language just a little bit, and hopefully we'll have that done the next day or two and get that bill introduced. And Representative Latta and I have been working on this for years, and we put it on the floor for a vote, and we've never been able to get it off the floor of the House. Let me ask the Cullens a question, and I don't know, you may not know the answer, just anecdotally. My gut tells me that there are a lot of parents who aren't as courageous and brave as you all have been, not only to come forward, but to admit that it was a case of fentanyl poisoning that caused your child's death, and that we have a lot of young people, and when I say young people, I think you mentioned it could be somebody's parent. It goes all the way up, even into our nursing homes, who have suddenly died at home. That is in reality a fentanyl poisoning case. They just don't want to tell their friends and neighbors, so when it comes out in the obituary or when they're talking to them, they say that. Is that anecdotally, have you all found that there are people who are like, yeah, that happened to my family too, but we just didn't tell anybody?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, when we were waiting to get when we were waiting to get the toxicology report, my wife was just very concerned that she was going to hear that it was a drug overdose. She didn't want Zach's reputation to be that he was a drug user, abuser, that sort of thing. But Congressman, I'll refer to, we joined a Facebook page called Lost Voices of Fentanyl. I'm not sure if you or your staffers have looked that up, but there's over 23,000 people on that page, and every one of them has lost a child, parent, sibling, father, mother. And it's kind of a safe space. So these people know that everybody there is going through the same thing that they have. So yeah, they would share probably among us more than they would with people in the public.
And if the chairman would give me just a real quick, another second or two. Suboxone, buprenorphine, in the omnibus, we lifted the number and made it unlimited, the number of patients that any one physician can monitor. I was strongly opposed to that. I think that could lead to abuse by some doctors. I know you wouldn't do that, or you wouldn't be here talking about all these problems. But do you fear that could lead to a problem as well, that you have an unlimited number that a single physician could be monitoring?
You know, I don't think so. And the reason is because it's really not a euphoric drug, and so it really doesn't get you high. And a lot of the formulations have Narcan in it, so it stops you from getting high. And when you make it easy, because you can have as many people on OxyContin as you want, it never made sense to me that there was controls based, and I think it just served to limit the amount of Suboxone and buprenorphine that could be prescribed. So I think it's actually going to be a good thing to allow that, because again, I can prescribe fentanyl lollipops to people, and no one's going to monitor that if and as a number of patients that I prescribe it to. But buprenorphine, because it stopped my group in emergency medicine from prescribing it. We all had to be certified to do it. So I think it's going to be a good effect.
I'll keep an eye on it, and I hope you're right. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Thank you. Next, I'll yield to Congressman Bill Arakis from Florida for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think this is working either. Can you hear me? Yeah, I guess you can now. I want to thank you for holding this hearing. Of course, thank the chairman of the committee. In particular, I want to thank the parents, Ray and Deb. Thank you again. It's extremely courageous for you to be here today publicly sharing the story of your son, and I'm so very sorry for your loss. You provide insight into the impact this crisis is having on families and demonstrate why we must address this scourge on our society as quickly as possible. We know that there was an increase in drug overdose deaths, up from the heartbreaking 107,000 to be exact, in 2021, and that fentanyl was present in over 2/3 of these deaths. This is alarming. Now I know there's no silver bullet, and we've been discussing, and I believe that we need to make it permanent. Schedule 1, there's no question, and I don't see why this isn't passing the House and the Senate, but it should be a priority. This is poison, folks, and y'all know this. This is poison. It's a weapon of mass destruction. Today, we have the opportunity to start discussing a multifaceted approach. We must do whatever we can to reduce the stigma attached to substance abuse disorder and addiction. We also must ensure that treatment is readily available for those in need, and we're working on that. And of course, we need to engage with law enforcement, thank you for being here today, sir, to ensure they are combating the transactional and the domestic criminal organizations that are trafficking and distributing this illicit fentanyl. In November, I had the opportunity to lead a congressional delegation visit to the Arizona-Mexico border, having in-depth conversations with Border Patrol agents, and most of us have been to the border, customs agents, and the local sheriffs. It was reiterated to me that by all stakeholders that our border is not secure and that they all are overwhelmed by the surge of illicit drugs that are flooding into our nation. One sheriff told me plainly that the border is a violent place and that they are at war, literally at war, with the cartels with little to no support from the Biden administration. If the media highlighted the amount of large-scale seizures these agents are conducting on a daily basis, we wouldn't hear about anything else, in my opinion. Here are some of the staggering headlines just from, this is in the past 10 days alone. and I have the newspaper articles right here. Parents charged after 1-year-old dies of drug poisoning in Deerfield Beach, Florida. Very frustrating. Woman charged in 4-year-old's fentanyl overdose death. From the medical examiner, 11-year-old died from fentanyl in her system, not from a fight at school. Middle-aged art teacher arrested after overdosing on fentanyl in front of students at a New Jersey public school. Norfolk deputy faints over fentanyl exposure at jail. Sheriff's office confirms. Sadly, the global drug trade has provided the United States with these headlines, unfortunately. We must have a properly secured southern border in order to start addressing this crisis. All the stakeholders I've engaged with at the Arizona-Mexico border spoke about the desperate need for resources in order to do this. Both Customs and Border Patrol and local sheriffs want to be able to better detect and seize these illicit drugs. I also want to know if Mexico is doing enough. I know last night I was watching the Mexican president saying that they're doing their share. I want to know if that's the case. Both Customs and Border Patrol and local sheriffs want to be able to better detect and seize these illicit drugs. I intend to investigate ways for Congress to appropriately fund and provide all the tools they need to hold the traffickers accountable and stop the creation and spread of new fentanyl-related substances. Dr. Westlake, the question. Fentanyl-related substances, class scheduling has already been in place for the last 5 years. Can you explain why we have continued to see an increase in fentanyl deaths? Does the policy not work? And you probably explained this, but let's reiterate it's so important. Does the policy not work, or can you explain what more is happening here and what tools we need to provide these properly prevent overdose? Now, I will tell you, I had a roundtable with kids, and you talk to the students, and they know the truth because they know what their friends are doing and how we can prohibit that. So, I would encourage all members to do that as well. We need to get to the bottom of this, folks. This is literally war, and it is a weapon of mass destruction. And again, what's the medical reason? I know you discussed it to a certain extent, but in layman terms, what is the medical reason for not scheduling this as a Schedule I drug? I've heard from physicians in the past, but I'm not convinced. And again, one other question, and then I don't have a lot of time. Is this fentanyl in vapes? Because these kids are vaping like crazy. And I know it's liquid and what have you, but is the fentanyl in vapes? And then I've heard different opinions on this as well. Give me the facts if you have them. What about marijuana? What about marijuana? I mean, everybody's talking about marijuana being a recreational drug and it should be legalized, what have you. I know that marijuana can be detrimental, particularly for children. And when I say children, I'm not talking about 18 and under. I'm talking about in their early 20s as well, because I consider those kids as well. So if you could explain, maybe give me some answers to those questions, I would appreciate it very much.
Sure. I'd like to focus on kind of the reason I came here, and that was to shed light on where the opposition, whether there's scientific basis behind the opposition. And that, that's a big talking point, is that fentanyl deaths are rising. It's a failed policy, a failed Trump administration policy, because that's when it came out. But that's just not true. That's confabulation. I think it's trying to pull criminal justice reform, and they know that there's energy behind this. That this is this is common sense, and it kind of has to pass. And so I think if there's any kind of justice in the world, and I think that they're trying to do that, and they put the theoretical rights of criminals above the kids. And so, you know, that's I think the reason that's why it's not passing. I mean, it definitely accomplishes exactly what it was intended on a very narrow and specific area. There's no scientific, you know, basis really that has merit to oppose it. Once you, and that's, I created a briefer that we gave to you all staff that goes into the detail of how we develop the language, and, you know, and it really kind of unveils the truth behind a lot of the politics and smokescreen stuff that's happening around this issue.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to yield to Congressman Bill Johnson.
Thank you, Dr. Joyce, and thanks to our panelists for being here, particularly Deb, you and Ray, for your courage and your willingness to be vulnerable and share your experience, the devastating loss of your son. You know, change starts with conversations, and it's these kinds of conversations as lawmakers that are critical when we talk with families and individuals that have been affected by fentanyl, public health officials and medical personnel who have experienced dealing with substance abuse, and the hardworking men and women in law enforcement that are working around the clock to try to keep our communities safe from this deadly drug. You know, conversations like this one also that we're having here today help us to move forward on our common goal, keeping fentanyl off the streets, out of our communities, and out of the hands of our young people. Needless to say, and you've all confirmed it, fentanyl is killing Americans all across the country at an alarming rate, our friends, our neighbors, and in some cases, our family members. My district in Appalachia, in Ohio, is no stranger to the dangers of fentanyl poisoning. It's part of our nation that's been especially devastated by fentanyl and the opioid crisis. Combating this crisis is going to take all of us uniting around common sense policies that mitigate the destruction that this drug is causing. We can start by supporting the move to permanently schedule all fentanyl-related substances into Schedule 1, and by opposing the weakening of criminal penalties for fentanyl-related crimes. Because I agree with you, it's murder. For a distributor, for a drug dealer to knowingly sell fentanyl-laced products to people, it should be counted as murder. It's no different than picking up a gun or a knife or another weapon and trying to take someone's life. It's also vitally important to note that President Biden's failure to secure our southern border has allowed fentanyl and other dangerous drugs to flow freely into the United States. So I can tell you around this table, you have our commitment to continue to press the Biden administration and our Democrat colleagues on the importance of securing our border and stopping the flow of illicit drugs like cocaine, like fentanyl, from coming across our border. So I want to thank you all again for being here. It takes a great deal of courage, and I look forward to helping be a part of this continuing conversation. But I do want to start with you, Mr. Neerum. I agree with my colleagues here today. Clearly, we need to schedule all of these fentanyl-related substances properly to stop foreign drug traffickers from tweaking their formulas to get around the laws here in the United States. But as I can tell you, in places like Ohio, these substances are pouring in to our communities, like I said, at alarming rates, regardless of their illegality. So with these actions that we're talking about today, would they assist the DEA? Would they make your job easier in enforcement, in being able to stop the shipments of this poison into our communities?
Thank you for that question. The answer, in short, in my opinion, is yes, because what it does is it addresses the challenge of the threat, because what you're looking at is the questionable legal status potentially of certain substances that are coming across. So you take that question off the table. And so that provides additional support to the law enforcement efforts and to our partners within CBP and other Border Patrol that are trying to address the smuggling coming across the border. So yes, it does help.
Okay. And also I know we're all alarmed at the state of the southern border. for many different reasons, where we know only a fraction of the fentanyl that we're catching coming through is intercepted. How can the U.S. government, the administration, us in Congress, what do you think we can do better that we're not already focused on? What's the magic formula to stop this stuff from coming across the border?
Unfortunately, I don't think there is a magic formula. I think the measures that we're talking about today will have an impact, and I think that they are something that adds additional tools to the arsenal of the investigator and the prosecutor. One thing that I would say is, and I was mentioning, I think, to Dr. Joyce before we started, when I was a young agent, I used to say and think that DEA could do more with less, and that that was a badge of honor. As I grew throughout the agency and in the executive positions I held when I retired, you can't do more with less. And so what I would say is that resources, not just for DEA in this arena, but also for our other federal, state, and local partners that are addressing this, are significant resources would be very much appreciated and helpful.
Crazy question. I just thought about this. You mentioned resources. I've actually participated in sting operations with law enforcement back in my home district in Ohio. Are dogs able to sniff out fentanyl the way they do other drugs, or are they at risk of ingesting? Is it a problem? Are we able to go after fentanyl like we do marijuana? Can animals sniff it out?
My experience is yes, that the animals, they are trained for that, and there have been some experience. I don't have it personally, but my understanding is that yes, they can be affected.
Okay. All right, I yield back. Thanks.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Congressman Wahlberg from the state of Michigan.
I hope it's on. Does it sound that way?
It's on.
Chris Reisner. I mentioned that name because I've told his folks, Dan and Julia Reisner, that any opportunity I had, I would mention his name. Like your son, he was a young man with a promising future, an athlete, scholarship, had an injury, and it all began. And ultimately, after 6 treatment centers, in-house treatment centers, and during those times, I spent time with him in sessions in high schools where he gave his story, in prisons and in jails where he gave his story and did his best. And ultimately, we thought that he was going to make it. Grandfather died. He was a victim. I think as we went through our efforts to get the Support Act and other things, those of us that served in bipartisan ways for a time working on this issue, we worked ourselves away from saying criminals and thinking of victims. And that was a start. That was a good start. We began to see the impact that the opioid, heroin abuse, and even fentanyl issues were going down. In my district, which stretches from Lake Michigan to Lake Erie, the entire southern border of Michigan, the I-75, I-94 corridor, drugs that come from Chicago into Michigan, Jackson, Detroit, Monroe, from Canada, with swimmers, kayakers, scuba divers taking the drugs across, let alone what's taking place at the southern border. Moving from there down to Toledo, Atlanta, any place else. It's become an issue that's taken the focus off of people like yourselves. Mike Hurst, whose son Andy died in the pit toilet on site. Mike Hurst, electrician, electrical contractor, his son died as a result of the overdose. Started the foundation for Andy's Angels, eventually developed Andy's Place, which is the first and the only, as far as I know, on-site center with subsidized housing with all of the facilities, organizations, legal and social, medical on-site to help people through that process and ultimately get them out of the treatment facilities into a real-life setting again and making it. We thought that was the only issue we had to deal with because we were going the right direction, and now we're back at it. And your testimony tells us we got to keep working. So thank you. Let me ask you, we've asked law enforcement and medical individuals here, and we thank you for being here, but you specifically, what, in your experience, what do families like yours and young people like Zachary feel that you've talked to feel that we need to do? What do they think would be more effective? Laws, certainly Schedule I, but what else can we do as people who have the ability to influence entities in our communities, in our educational systems, in our churches, in whatever? What further things can we do that you can tell us today from your experience?
I think it still goes back to the awareness, right? So I think that the general public has a short attention span, and we always hear about the news cycles, that this is something that needs to be constantly at the forefront. I don't think we're hearing enough about fentanyl arrests and convictions and sentencing. I think that some of that might go to be a deterrent. I just don't think, as I've myself watched the evening news or the morning news or listening to it on the radio, unless you're listening to a specific program, you're not really getting any kind of detail as to the enormity of the problem. And again, our whole mission and goal is to just continue to raise the awareness. So as we raise the awareness to you, how you can raise it in your own districts, and obviously raise it to the level of legislation and putting these people in prison. That's the start.
I wonder too, if more kids knew that 60% of the drugs out there, like if they had something in front of them and they knew that they had a 60% chance of dying that night if they decided to take that, like, would that make a difference? I mean, I know young people think they're invincible, but I think if that figure was out there, I think maybe that would help some too.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because, I mean, we can make all the laws in the books, and people find their ways around it. And to lay a black body bag next to an individual, and that ultimately doesn't stop it. With Chris Reisner, he knew it all, but at a point in time, and I think that's an effort we have to beef up, and that isn't partisan. And so thank you all for being here. I'll yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'll yield to Congressman Carter from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. Thank you all for being here. I cannot tell you how much this means to us. Your testimony, your expertise is invaluable for us to hear from you. You know, we know that we've got an epidemic here in America, and we know what a problem it is, and certainly you know as well as anyone what a problem it is. And you've heard all the stats. Enough fentanyl in this country to kill every American 10 times over. Enough fentanyl in this country, we're losing people every 7.5 minutes. And it's an issue that every community experiences. And that's what I think frustrates me more than anything, especially about the southern border, because a lot of people look at that on TV or in the media and they think it's just a problem at the southern border. But it's not. These drugs are infesting communities everywhere. Even in I represent South Georgia. I represent the entire coast of Georgia. And I've got a lot of rural areas in my district. And even there, we're having problems, serious problems. In fact, the overdose, the fentanyl deaths in Georgia, up 800%. 800%, unbelievable. I want to share a quick story with you. I'm a pharmacist. Did y'all know that? Yeah, I thought you did. Yeah, it came up once or twice.
The oldest pharmacist.
The oldest pharmacist in Congress. But I do want to share a story with you because it is embarrassing to me that this happened. But I was at a town hall meeting, and I misspoke. I called this fentanyl overdose. I called it fentanyl addiction. and a mother who had lost a child. God bless her, she corrected me. And she was right and I was wrong. She said, no, sir, it's fentanyl poisoning. And she was right. It is fentanyl poisoning. I want to ask you, Mr. Nerium, does the DEA recognize individuals who die because of fentanyl poisoning as victims of a crime? Now, I'm asking about the DEA. I'm not asking about law enforcement.
The DEA is taking a very direct approach in working with families. I'm aware of family summits that they've held recently. I do know that there have been times when death resulting from charges were pursued, and so it is something that we're very focused on.
Over 107,000 overdose deaths in this country last year, many of them due to fentanyl. 200 people every day. I mean, it is without question an epidemic, and it's an embarrassment to me that in this previous Congress, this Democratic-controlled Congress, not a single bill was passed to deal with the fentanyl crisis. Unbelievable. I just can't believe that it's not getting the attention that it should be getting. I want to ask you, again, Mr. Canary, and I want to actually publicly applaud the FDA because I know that they have already started with the packaging information for over-the-counter naloxone. They've actually started preparing for that, and I applaud them for that. Even though it hasn't been passed yet, they've started, and they're encouraging companies, manufacturers, to apply for that. They want this to happen. I think that's unprecedented for a government agency like that, especially the FDA, to take that kind of initiative, and I thank them for that. Dr. Westlake, what does that look like in your practice? What does it look like in community pharmacy if we have that available?
To have so you have to prescribe Narcan?
Right.
I think it's fantastic. I think it's a great idea. It really doesn't make any sense why it's not, because there's no harmful effects from it. So the only thing it does is reverses, kicks the opioids off the opioid receptor. So I mean, if you're on opioids and you take it, you'll be in pain, but if you're not taking it, if I took it right now, I wouldn't feel anything. There's no side effects to it. So it's one of those things where I don't see any reason why there'd be any reason to have it be prescription.
Good. Two more things real quick. First of all, we've got to address also the rogue internet and what's going on with internet pharmacies and the ability of these children and these kids to be able to get these drugs over the internet. That's it. We know what a problem that is. But I want to very quickly ask all four of you if you could just comment, because Gus Bilirakis asked a question a little while ago that unfortunately we didn't get a chance to answer, and that's about marijuana. And I just want to know your thoughts, and I'm not going to preface it with my feelings. I'm just asking you your thoughts about marijuana and the legalization of marijuana.
So I was on the Controlled Substance Board in Wisconsin, and we had the ability to schedule different things, and so marijuana was one of the things. I think there's a kind of some false narrative out there that it's a drug. I mean, that it's a medicine. It hasn't been studied, in the way that other medicines have been studied. I think the true argument to have is that, it's definitely an intoxicant, and should it be legalized as an intoxicant? To weasel the kind of the way in the back and say, it's a drug it's a medicine. So if you're in pain and you get drunk, you're gonna feel better while you're intoxicated. And I think there are studies that need to be done. I'm not saying that it's not. And the bills that, the Halt Fentanyl Act has, scheduling for, the ability, decreased regulatory oversight of all Schedule I. So there could be studies done, and there might be medical applications for it. But right now, it's really...
And I'm not opposed to that. Please understand. Yeah. I should have been more specific. I'm talking about the recreational use of marijuana.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
What I'll say after having done more than 30 years in DEA is it's still a controlled substance. But I do know the DEA has worked over the last several years to support additional research on the potential medical application.
And I'm all for that. I think we all are. But again, I'm talking specifically about the recreational use of marijuana.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, Congressman, but again, it's still a regulated,
Understood.
controlled substance.
Ms.
I'll just jump in and say, from a recreational marijuana standpoint, I know that Zach had done that. I don't know of anybody who made better decisions as a result of using recreational marijuana. I think that leads to a diminishing of some capacity and capabilities, and that kind of leads to other poor decisions down the road, or even that night.
Yeah, I mean, I just would wonder how many people that have done other drugs, cocaine or whatever, how many of them actually started with recreational marijuana?
Bingo, that's what I'm getting at.
Right.
My opinion, it's a gateway drug. I didn't want to say it before I gave you the opportunity to answer, but, I've listened to these experts come in here and tell, oh, it desensitizes the receptors, and then, I'm sorry, I'm still not convinced that it's not, that the recreational use of marijuana is nothing more than a gateway drug. And I'll just end with that. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the members for being present here today to ask these informative questions. I'd like to thank those who testified, Dr. Westlake for giving us input from a medical perspective. An imagery of a body bag beside someone who's overdosed will never leave any member's mind, what you presented to us. Mr. Knierim, to have the impact of your presentation from a DEA perspective, again, gives us messaging to come home. And then finally, to my constituents, to the Cullens for bringing your story here today. I think each one of us have been impacted by your presence and your ability to tell Zach's story from the bottom of my heart. I thank you for coming here in your sorrow to protect others from facing the same problem. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I think it is.